right, I gotta check again. How are you guys doing? You guys good? You guys are starting to wake up. I like this. Well, I am super excited about today. This is a guy I've been trying to get preach since I met him. His story rocks my world, and there's so many stories about his life that rocks my world. AJ Hofstetter has become a very dear friend of mine. We spend a lot of time, our love language is trash talking for the most part, but that's what makes us get along. But this guy is a branding genius. He runs a company called Brand Office. He's a writer by trade. He just authored his new book, Take Time to Be Brief. Highly recommend it if you're like me and talk too much. It's just the guy, he bleeds Jesus when he talks, and you'll see a theme about my friends. Most of us are just incredibly broken people that found Jesus along the way, and when he talks, when he shares, he truly does bleed Jesus. He's not trying to impress anyone. He's not trying to be a professional public speaker. He's just trying to let the love and grace and miraculous hand of God be pouring out of him. So whatever he has today, I'm expectant. I have a deep sense of anticipation that there's going to be something amazing that happens, at least in one person's heart today, because this story, his message is always blowing me away. So with that said, AJ Hofstetter, would you please come up?
Wow. I don't even know what to do now. I better prepare something. I will say I have a brand company, but I also have a ministry, and that ministry is called Armin. There you go. Trash talk for you. No, thank you so much for this opportunity. Many years ago, before I start that, he said something about a commonality among his friends. You know, the way that I say that is, I'm drawn to people with a limp, people who have been beaten down a little bit by life. He and I were just talking the other day, and I have a thing that I say, I've never been a very good sinner, and I've never been a very good saint. I've never felt I fit in very well either place. I don't really want what all the sinners have. I don't really feel equipped the way I see other saints equipped, and I don't really feel, maybe worth stepping into some of the shoes of people who have gone before me, or people who I look at who are so gifted, and I just sit here then with not being a good sinner, not being a very good saint, and then I just find, well, maybe it's not about me at all. And I start to find a little bit of peace, a semblance of peace, when I realize maybe life is much better lived when it's not about me at all. And so that's been a snapshot of a little bit of the story I want to share with you today. And I want to talk about a story that you've undoubtedly heard probably a million times. And you have formed your own opinions around this story, I'm sure. And it's a common story in the Word. We hear about it a lot. But before I get into all of that, I do want to share with you briefly, I want to share with you quickly a little bit about my life. My name, AJ Hofstetter. The name AJ stands for Andrew Joseph. The name Andrew means strong and manly, which is, I'm sure, what you all assumed the name meant when you found out my name was Andrew. And the name Joseph means God will increase, which is my favorite meaning of a name in all the world. So I'm very thankful for that middle name of mine. Grew up in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio, and then I moved to Minnesota when I was 18 years old. And I'll tell you a little story of why I moved to Minnesota. I moved to Minnesota because I used to choose, I'm not even going to be able to finish this statement without you guys immediately responding. I used to choose God's will for my life based on what I least wanted to do. Minnesota was that. I had this idea that I am meant for warm climates. I am meant for flip-flops. I had a man bun in the year 2002, long before man buns were cool. I had a man bun. Now a lot of you guys are saying, and that's why I'm done listening. But I lived in Hawaii at the time, so it was a little bit more excusable. But so I moved to Minnesota when I was 18 because I was like, I want to move to California, I want to move to Hawaii, I want to move to Florida. So I'm going to go the opposite. Because if I'm miserable, God can make me holy. And so that was my faith. That was the God that I served. Was this like, well, I know that he just wants me. I know that he just wants me to be a better guy. So I better go somewhere where he can really make me suffer. And here I am. So with that, I went to college here in Minnesota. I met my bride, Rachel, in college. We got set up on a blind date. And we've been married now for 22 years. And we have 4 kids. Feels like 5 times that amount, but we have 4 kids. And we have been a little bit kind of all over the country. We lived in Oregon for a while. We lived in Hawaii for a while. We lived in Fiji for a while. I realize that's a different country. We were all over the place. We did a lot of different things. If I showed you my resume, what you would see would be like a 40-page PDF, like single-spaced. I built houses. I was an IT consultant. I was in full-time ministry. I worked, everything you could imagine I've done. And for a long time, for a good number of years, it all felt a little bit random. It all felt a little bit like, what is that? There is no common theme in all of this. And eventually I was able to kind of find my way through. But what I have discovered and what I want to unpack a little bit today is a story, like I said, a story that you've undoubtedly heard a million times before. My wife, Rachel, she has this thing that she says, because I work with people with their brand, right? I work with branding and marketing, and I help people figure out who they are so they can talk about themselves effectively. And a lot of times that just means they have to do the hard work of things that are already inside of them. They just have to kind of unpack it and articulate it a little better. And so I spend a lot of time with people doing that. She said this thing that I take with me into almost every client interaction. And she said this: a cliche is only a cliche because we've stopped believing the words that it's made of. A cliche is only a cliche because we've stopped believing the words that it's made of. And so you can think about different cliches that you hear, things that you hear just kind of like, oh yeah, I've heard this before, you know. Sometimes we're guilty of cliches and we're not even thinking about the words we're using. Someone says, like, well, I'm just really having a hard day. I was like, well, I'll be praying for you. Like, we've made that a cliche because we no longer believe those words because we're not going to be praying for them. We're just going to say that. Or we're saying like horrible things like, well, let go and let God, and things that I don't even know where that comes from. Definitely not the Bible. But where this idea that we just take these things and we throw them at people as if they're answers, right? And I pick on realtors a little bit in this space because if you go to a realtor's website, every realtor website says, I value integrity and experience. It's like, everybody values integrity and experience. Like, it's a cliche, right? You see what I'm saying? Like, these words, they lose something over time. And those words, when they lose something, when they no longer mean what they used to mean, we can no longer hear the words, we can no longer hear the meaning. They lose their power. Words lose their power. I tell clients that if a word you're using is a cliche, you have 2 choices. Either you have to re-infuse meaning into that word. Integrity means this. You either have to re-infuse meaning into that word, or you have to find a better word, right? If it's just a word that's too, whatever, riddled down, clunky with cliche. So with that, with the story that I want to unpack now, briefly, it's a story of David and Bathsheba. And undoubtedly you've heard the story before. If you haven't heard the story, if you're not familiar with the story, the idea is there's all kinds of ways to unpack the story, and we've heard a lot of sermons about it. There's even VeggieTales stories about it. There's everywhere you look, you can find something about this in our faith. But in 2 Samuel chapter 12, after the story of David and Bathsheba, where David enters into sin, and then he commits adultery, he commits murder, and then he covers it up. And in all of that, he's rebuked, and he comes to God, and he says, "Forgive me." And Psalm 51 is his story, is his psalm where he says, "Cleanse me, clean me, I've got nothing. Please forgive me." I got a good buddy who wrote a book about that psalm because he used to consider that like the psalm of people who do like the really bad sins. And then one day he woke up and realized that is the prayer of a human. That is our prayer as a human. But anyway, so after all of this happens, Nathan rebukes David. David repents. And this is where I pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Then David confessed to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "Yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for this sin. Nevertheless, because you have shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord by doing this, your child will die." After Nathan returned to his home, the Lord sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife. David begged God to spare the child. He went without food and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. Then on the 7th day, the child died. David's advisors were afraid to tell him. He wouldn't listen to reason while the child was ill, they said. What drastic thing will he do when we tell him the child is dead? When David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. "Is the child dead?" David asked. "Yes," they replied, "he is dead." Then David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went to the tabernacle and worshiped the Lord. After that, he returned to the place and was served food, and he ate. So, kind of a bummer of a story, right? Like, we see the story of David who commits these vile sins before the Lord, and then we see David and Bathsheba's son that was born from that sin. We see him die as judgment. So, I'll tell you a little bit more about my story. I've told you a little bit about how I used to choose God's will for my life. And part of the reason that I chose God's will for my life the way that I did, as much as I joke around about Minnesota being where I didn't want to live and whatever, and here I am now living here, and I came back here, right? But as much as I joke about that, it's also very true. This awareness that I had to prove. I had to prove that I was committed to God. I had to prove that I was worthy of love. I had to prove. And I lived my life trying to prove it. I lived my life trying to change. I lived my life trying to be a better man. And the problem with not being a good sinner and not being a good saint, there's a lot of good things about not being a good sinner. Right? A lot of good things about that, at least in circles that we travel in, right? Where it's like, well, hey, you had a little bit too much to drink, but it's not like you were sloppy. And hey, you did this, but at least you didn't do that. That's a pretty good thing. But when you're not a very good saint, and when the God that you serve is sitting there waiting for you to be a better person, that gets very discouraging very quickly. And I was too bound by guilt and obligation to jump into the deep end of sin. And I was too restricted, too bound by this fear of a God who would push me down the stairs or reject me if I screwed up. So then I wanted to please him, but that wasn't because I really loved him or because I really understood. You know what I love about worship today when we were worshiping? Was the realization, I was sitting here, I go to Eagle Brook Church. And I leaned over to Armin when we were worshiping, and I was like, I forgot that there were churches who kept the lights on during worship. You know, you go to Eagle Brook, and this isn't a dig on Eagle Brook, I like it. It's just kind of like, you know, lights go out, it's like fog machines, like, you know, like, yeah, you know, like, and I loved the lights on and just this exchange of worship. See, I used to view worship as God, like, just God's there, and he's like, tell me I'm awesome, tell me I'm awesome, tell me I'm great. You come to church and you worship because God is big and you are little. Don't forget that. It's like, wow, like I'm really excited for heaven where I get to do this all the time. That's what it felt like to me all the time. It always felt like God needed me to worship him. And maybe I'm alone in this, but it didn't motivate me to worship him very much. But then when I discovered that worship is when I align with him. A.W. Tozer says, when the eyes of man looking out meet the eyes of God looking in, there heaven has begun upon the earth. So discovering worship as aligning with him, and when we are aligned with him, we receive an infusion of truth. And when we are infused with truth, we become who he meant us to be. We discover who he truly is, and that is the one who pours into us. So in God's twisted economy, we worship him and we receive. So when we're here worshiping, this isn't us singing songs to a God who needs us to tell him this. It's him saying, son, daughter, when you align with what is true, your spirit will come alive. This is for you. That is the abundant goodness of God. Well, for a long time, I didn't see God that way. I didn't know God that way. He was distant. He was hard to please. And it led me to live very scared of him, very scared of disappointing him. Well, anyway, I won't get into all of that now, except to say, one day, my life all kind of caught up to me. Not being a good sinner, not being a good saint. I found myself one day just kind of laid bare. You guys ever been in this situation where you realize, like, I've been kind of a fraud. I've been kind of making things up. I'm a liar or whatever. Maybe you got busted and called out on a big sin. Maybe you just came in front of Jesus one day and realized I've been a liar, I've been a fraud. Well, for me, I got called out on some sin, much like Nathan called out David. And I had to be honest. Probably for the first time, really ever in my life, I was really honest about my life and about the choices I was making. And I remember I sat with a friend of mine, and I was confessing my sin to him, and I was just saying, like, I've never been good at this, and I've just been a liar. And then he sat with me, and he helped me unpack it. He talked me through it. And then I remembered this story that I just read to you, where David came to God, and he said, I'm sorry. And then God said, you will not die for your sin, but what did he say next? But your son will die for your sin. And I remembered that story because remember, God is waiting for me to screw up. God is waiting for me to mess up. God is waiting to catch me in my sin. And then I became overwhelmed with fear because I have a little boy. My little boy is named Beckett. And Beck is an amazing, amazing human being. And I remember in that moment, I said to my buddy, I remembered this story, and I said, is my boy gonna die because of my sin? And my buddy looked at me and he said, no, because God's boy did. See, here's the thing, is I was willing to go to hell for my sin. Some people might call me arrogant for saying that. But I know what the wages of sin is. The wages of sin is death. And I know what I deserve. I know who I've been. I know the choices I've made. But my boy has to go to, he has to pay the penalty because I'm not a good sinner and I'm not a good saint, because I don't understand the heart of God, because I have internalized things the wrong way, because I've never really been, I've always had my feet in two worlds. My boy? Because of my sin, my boy? And then God said, no, son, my boy. See, a cliche is only a cliche if you stop believing the words that it's made of. For God so loved the world that he gave his boy, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. Forget about me. I know I deserve hell. That wasn't my cross that Jesus took. It was Beckett's cross. The gospel is that. To understand the love of God for you, not as something that is withholding and distant. To understand the love of God, not as something that makes you feel you have to perform, but the love of God that says, your sin means your boy or your girl or the innocent need to go to the cross. But guess what? My boy will do it. So one of my original plans was that my daughter Ava was going to be with me today. Ava is 16. She's my favorite of my four. Just kidding. Sage, you're my favorite. Just kidding, Presley. You know it's you. Just kidding, Beckett. I already said you're awesome. So, but Ava, with the kids, I have a thing that I say, but I have asked Armin to speak on Ava's behalf. And while Ava is much better looking than Armin, Armin, will you answer as Ava would answer?
I'll hit the high note.
Good. Do it. Okay. Armin, what is the story of David and Bathsheba about?
Jesus.
Interesting. What is the story of Noah about?
Jesus.
What is the story of Ruth about?
Jesus.
Jeremiah?
Jesus.
Ezekiel?
Jesus.
Naomi?
Jesus.
David and Jonathan?
Jesus.
You guys get the point. You do a terrible Ava.
I know.
Yeah, it showed. It's all a story of Jesus. It's all a story of God's work to sow a thread in all of history, to show us his plan, to make it possible that our boys don't have to die. That is the gospel. It's all a story of Jesus. So when you're reading, I mean, there are parts of the Bible, I'm not going to lie, not easy to read. Not because of the weight of the topic, but because it's grueling and painful and confusing. There's things that I read, I'm like, kids, don't read that part. Like, there are parts I don't understand. There are parts that seem beyond me. It's all a story of Jesus. The beginning of this is the kickoff of the Nonprofits series. Is that true? And the series is called Nonprofits. And here's the thing, is that God has used prophets to speak his truth. He used them throughout the Old Testament. What were the books of the prophets about, by the way? Jesus. God has used prophets to speak his truth. And in some ways, it's safe to say that God needed prophets because people weren't hearing his voice. And then in other ways, we look at it and we see John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word was with God. Wow, sorry about butchering that. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. So in some ways, God used prophets because people weren't listening to his voice. But the beauty of what we see through the whole of Scripture, through the whole narrative, is the common thread of Jesus. For God so loved the world that he gave his boy. Don't let words lose their meaning. A cliche is simply something we've heard too much. So what are the implications of this for you? It means that burden that you walked in here with can be lifted. Because there's no more earning, there's no more proving, there's no more pace. There's not a person in this room who doesn't think they shouldn't be further along in life than they are right now. And there's not a person in this room who Christ would have not chosen. He chose to die knowing, like right before you were about to make your worst decision. The implications of the cross and of the gospel and of what we see here are that we get to live, and that our boys get to live, and our girls get to live, our kids get to live. Not because of anything in us. Don't let those words lose their meaning. In March of 2015, I was taking out the trash, as I often do, and I was having this conversation with God. And at that time, I was still my life was just kind of laced with compromise. I wasn't trying to compromise, and I wasn't like compromising in cool ways. I was just, like I said, not a good saint. But I remember just being frustrated. I'd grown up my whole life. I was a Christian, and I got a degree in theology, and I was a pastor and a missionary, and I did it all, and I was like, this is so frustrating. I remember just saying to God once, March 2015, I said, God, either you are the God who can raise the dead, or you're not. If you are the God that can raise the dead, I'm all in. I'm all in. I want it all. I want the whole you and nothing less. I want everything, and you can have all of me if you are the God that can raise the dead. If you're not that, though, I'm out. Because I'm tired of serving an unseen, distant Lord. I'm tired of wondering if I'm measuring up. I'm tired. I'm just tired. Well, time went on, and a couple months later, my wife and I found out we were pregnant. The day after we found out she was pregnant, I lost my job. This is when my resume got really thick, too, with all kinds of alternate experiences, things. And I ended up kind of bouncing around between jobs. Things weren't really landing for me. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then at the 20-week ultrasound, I remember we found out at that point, we were on our way to the ultrasound, and all four of us, my two daughters and my wife and I, and my one daughter who was 4 at the time, my daughter Sage, my favorite one, she goes, I think, we're like, is it going to be a boy? Is it going to be a girl? What it's going to be? And Sage was like, it's going to be a boy and a girl. I'm like, you shut your mouth when you're talking to me, you know, like, and we got there and we found out it was twins, boy-girl twins. Just bonkers. Funny story, that afternoon I went golfing. It was already planned. So I was like, yeah, I'll go golfing after the ultrasound, you know, whatever. Well, I just had I'm still unemployed. And I'm like, oh, good, yeah, let's just throw extra kids in there. That'll be easy. I remember I was out there golfing. Best tee shot of my life, guys. I mean, I just crushed this ball. I think it was just all the angst and self-loathing that just really allowed me to crush it. And it was amazing. And I remember my brother-in-law was with me, and I remember I went up to I looked at the ball when I got to it, just forever away from the tee box. I mean, it was such a great shot. I remember looking at it, and I was just crying. And my brother-in-law was like, that was a good shot. But I feel like, okay, you know? And then I was like, it's twins, you know, and I was a mess. I was like, I'm unemployed or whatever. And then he laughed at me really hard. But I just remember the fear and the panic that I had. Like, I'm unemployed, I've got all these issues, whatever. And that was in August that we found that out. Well, then the twins were due in January. Mid-December, we went in for a checkup, and we found out that little girl was in distress, and there was a problem. And they said, well, we're going to have to move on this pretty quickly. That was on a Thursday. And they said, we're going to have to move on this pretty quickly. She's being malnourished right now, and there's some issues. We're going to have to move. So the next day, we were going to go in for an appointment, and they were going to decide what to do then and whatever. Well, that night, my wife's water broke, and so I rushed her. You know, the neighbor came over to sit with the older two, and it was like early Friday morning. My wife and I got in the car. I drove her to the hospital, and little boy was born without incident. He was born, it was a couple issues, but nothing big. And then there was, the room just changed. And this little boy was okay, but they said, gotta get the baby. And then they looked at me and my mother-in-law, and they said, you guys gotta go. And the last thing I remember is they put a mask over my wife, and she passed out, and I had to leave the room. Well, then I started hearing, I think it was code pink is what they said. And I saw a crash cart go by. And I was down in this room where they had put us earlier, and I was waiting. And then she fought really, really hard. They said that she went 9 minutes without any oxygen, blood supply, anything, because there was an abruption of the placenta, and so she went 9 minutes, and then they did CPR for 20 minutes. At one point during that, they came in and they were giving me an update, and they said, we're doing everything we can, but we're losing her. And I didn't know at that point if they meant my wife or my daughter, and they meant my daughter, and then they finally said, it's time for you to come see her. And I went in to that room, and what I saw was a gray, lifeless baby on the table, and kind of a somber place. And then they said, they invited me in to say goodbye to her. And my wife was a singer-songwriter, and she has some albums, and I put one of her albums on my phone. I just played my wife's music, and I talked to my little girl in that moment. And then the doctor called time of death while I was there. It had been like 30 minutes, you know. And then I leaned over her, and my mother-in-law, I remember saying, my mother-in-law said to me, she said, your daughter needs to hear your voice. And I leaned over to her, and I started talking to her about her mom. Be brave like your mom. And I don't even remember everything that I said, but I do remember that I put my hand on her, and I don't have big hands, but man, I looked like a giant compared to her. She was 3 pounds. She was this gray and tiny little thing, and I put my hand on her, and I was whispering to her, and then I said, in the name of Jesus, breathe. And that little girl, like she'd been holding her breath for 9 minutes, or like she'd been holding her breath for 29 minutes, went, the nurse next to me says to the nurse on the other side of me, did you see that? And the other nurse goes, I saw that. The doctor's like, what happened? Like, she's breathing. We have a heartbeat. At one point, one of the doctors said, there's an invisible heartbeat. How is this blood pumping if the heart hasn't started moving again yet? What they discovered was blood was pumping, but still wasn't a heartbeat. And this little girl went from gray and lifeless. She was pink. She was alive, fully alive, in a matter of seconds. And then they were like, well, she probably won't make it through the hour. She probably won't make it through the day. She probably won't make it through the week. We're done guessing. We don't know what's going on. It's an anomaly. You call it whatever you want. That little girl is the snarkiest human being. Oh, lovely. Her name is Presley. Alive and well. The twins are 7.5. Just amazing. Amazing. The God who can raise the dead. He's not in the business of getting you to behave yourself. He's in the business of wooing you. He's in the business of saying, son, daughter, no more earning. Let me show you my power. Now, he may not choose to raise the dead. Because what I find, a lot of times we want to believe that God can do a miracle, but we don't want to be in a situation where we need a miracle. Like, I don't want my daughter to die. And then people say to me, like, well, how did you have the faith to... I didn't have the faith. I don't know where. I wish I could just say, like, well, because I knew that the God of ages was inside. Like, no, nothing. All I had was desperation. But God is in the business of wooing you, not in the business of getting you to behave yourself. Worship is not us singing at a God who needs our validation. Worship is us aligning with what is true. And when we align with what is true, God himself speaks to us. And then we receive all that he meant for us to receive in the first place. An encounter with God is not a measure of your proximity to him. It's a measure of your receptivity to him. Our receptors get dulled all the time with Netflix and with shame, with stress and with money. Our receptors get dulled all the time. God is here to woo you. You don't have to be a good sinner. You don't have to be a good saint, because this is about God who let his boy die so that my boy didn't have to die. And that is love. A cliche is only a cliche if we stop believing the words that it's made of. Do not let. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. Don't let that lose its meaning. Because the God who raised the dead is the same God who's wooing each of us with his love, with his power, with his restoration. He can raise the dead. He can raise the dead in your life, in your marriage, in your job, in your life. He can raise the dead. He's not here to change you into a better version of you. He's here to show you that he made you and that he loves you, and he's here to woo you. Pray with me. Lord God, we ask you to be at the very center of our lives, not so that we can perform better, not so that we can earn something, but so that we can see, so that our hearts and our eyes can align with what is true. And when that truth is revealed, it changes us from the inside out. Open our eyes to see you, open our ears to hear you, open our hearts to receive you in all of the things that you want to show us as our good Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
Just take a second and close your eyes for a second, if you would, please. What is it in your life that was a dream, that was a goal, that was a hope, that's died. And do you believe that it can be resurrected? Because all I want to do, and you guys can open up your eyes now, whatever it was that you were thinking about as we go into this last song of worship, my prayer is that your faith would be rising right now to know inside your heart that if a human body can die and be resurrected, that your hope, your dream, your goals, your aspirations, your marriage, your parenting, your business, your job, your whatever you're going through has resurrection power in it too. So as we go into this last song, why don't we just stand up for this last song? I know it gets weird to surrender, and I know it's sometimes weird to see someone holding their hands up, like, what's that guy doing? It's all good. You have no idea what somebody is struggling with, and maybe they just need to say, I'm done, God, I need you. I have nothing else, God, I just need you. And if you're in that situation, just have freedom. Raise your hand, go on your knees, do whatever you got to receive this, and just know that there is a miracle waiting for your life. I promise you, I know AJ, he does not deserve it. He's a crappy human being just like me. And we share each other's stories about how crappy of a human beings we are. And there's nothing about us that is deserving of a miracle and not you. That is the most ridiculous thing in the world, to look at crappy human beings and think, oh, they deserve a miracle, but I don't. I promise you, you're better than us. You're more righteous than us. You're holier than us. You're better Christians than us. You've done better longer than we have. So if we have miracles in our lives, I promise you, you will have it in your life because you're more deserving of it than we are. So let's just worship like there is a miracle about to take place.